In this video, I'm going to share my process for painting this bright, snowy mountain. I had the pleasure of painting this for one of my patrons, so thank you all very much for your support, and Lauren, I hope you really love your painting. And as a reminder, I do have a full class about painting mountains over on Skillshare and also downloadable on Gumroad. For this technique, it's best to choose a reference of a mountain peak or a range of mountains on a bright sunny day with lots of snow. So this is the reference I chose. However, I do deviate quite a bit from the overall details. I mainly just use this to inspire the composition. And it's also really good to have one or two specific references that you can just quickly glance at during the process to remind you where the brightest parts and the darkest parts of the painting usually are. Of course, you can always do an actual portrait of a mountain, like a very realistic, and follow all the details of a specific mountain. But in my case, I tend to just use them as the initial inspiration and then kind of run with it and do whatever I want. And the first thing we're going to do is break the scene down into 3 parts. And by that I mean I want you to identify 3 specific areas: the sky, all the brightest highlights, which would usually be the snow, and all of the obvious shadows. This is probably the best repeatable strategy I know for painting such a complex scene. There are so many variations in light and shadow and color in these scenes, even though it might seem like it's just a couple colors, but if you zoom in and look up close, a lot of times there's so much going on. So start getting into the habit of recognizing these 3 zones in your mountain scenes. When I sketch, I'm pretty much only sketching in the boundary lines of my shadows, since that's pretty much what I'm painting. The brightest value we have is the color of our paper. So all of that snow, all of that bright highlight area needs to be the paper. And that's why planning ahead is very important in a scene like this. I highly recommend working on nice, thick, heavy watercolor paper that is 100% cotton, because that's going to give you a longer time to work within these big wet areas. If it dries super quickly, you're going to struggle to create the effects that I'm going to show you. And as you can see, I'm just laying in some clear water. Although mine is slightly tinted, sometimes I find it a little helpful to have just the teeniest tint of color so I can actually see where all my water is, but it's not necessary. And the reason I'm adding water first is so that when I start putting in my shadows, it's going to flow and bleed and give me some soft edges and soft areas as well. So the whole thing won't just be like a hard brush stroke. You'll see what I mean in a moment. In a painting like this, brush control is extremely important. Here's a couple tips that have worked for me. Keeping the pointy end of the brush, the very tip of it, towards the edge that you want to be a hard line is ideal. Keeping the big fat part of the brush away from the hard edge, so like where you want the water to kind of flow and be softer, because that area of the brush holds so much water, it's a bit easier to get a softer edge. So using the different parts of the brush to create different marks is really important for this type of scene, especially because we're working so quickly. And within the shadows, we have a variation in value. So some areas will be a lot darker than others. It's actually helpful to think of the shadow area as its own value structure within the painting. So we have our bright sunny snow, which is just one value, it's white. And then within the shadows, we have all of the variation in our values. So within the snow, we actually have some reflected light bouncing around, and those will be the lighter blue areas. And then in the deep shadowy areas, we're going to add a lot more pigment, and that's what I'm doing now. But remember that watercolor dries lighter, so you have to be a bit brave when you're adding pigment. You don't want it to dry super, super light, because then your bright, sunny, snowy areas won't seem so bright. The darker you go in the shadows, the brighter the sun effect is going to be. However, at the moment, we're not painting any exposed rock. Usually the exposed rock is going to be the darkest part of the painting, and oftentimes it just looks pure black. So for now, we're just focusing on the shadows, and then we'll let that dry and we'll come back in with the rock texture. Usually I try to pick one or two really big shadow areas to focus on, and then I'll have a couple smaller areas that are not quite so intense. So here on the upper left, or at the very top ridge, I'm going to include a bit of shadow, but it's not going to be anywhere near as dark, and it'll also be very soft. So I'm adding a lot of water and diluting it and letting it kind of fade and bleed into that big watery area. When it comes to painting the sky, you could either do this first or in the middle or last. The only thing that matters is that you can't let the sky bleed into the mountain. So ideally, you would do it when your top edge of your mountain is not wet. Sometimes I chance my luck and I do it anyway, and then I'll get a bit of bleed, like the mountain color bleeds up into the sky, but it's just something to think about or to plan for. So when you're doing this, it can be a bit challenging to remember where you are in the reference. Like there's so many different things going on, and that's why I always keep that simplified version of the reference in the back of my mind, which I actually have it up here on the screen. So instead of getting bogged down by all of the variation I see in the actual reference, I'm really only thinking about the simplified version, and then I can play with it as much as I want within those simplified areas. So I'm making up most of this as I go. As long as I get these big shadowy areas and some of the smaller shadowy areas as well, I'm happy and I can have a lot of fun within them. Okay, let's jump up into the sky. Now, you could choose any color you want for the sky, but one thing to keep in mind is that for a bright sunny day, typically we'll lean more towards the blue end of the spectrum. You can also do a variation of blue, so keeping it a bit darker at the top of the painting, at the top of the page, and then fading a bit more to a sky light blue towards the mountain. But I kept it very simple and I went with a very pale blue because I used to experience these skies a lot in Denver and I loved it. The darker you go in the sky, the brighter the snow is going to appear. So if you want the top ridge of the mountain to really pop and really stand out, you'll use a darker sky color. If you decide to go with a more colorful option like sunset or sunrise, keep in mind that that light in the sky needs to be reflected in the snow. The snow reflects whatever is around it, basically. So it wouldn't really make sense to have pure white snow with a sunset. It can work, and it could just be a style choice, but just, if you're going for more realism, that's something to keep in mind. You'll have to kind of mimic the sky color, but probably in a very, very light way in the snow. And your shadows would be a different color as well. They would probably be more on the purple side of things with a hint of the warmer tones that you're using. Now that the big shadowy areas are complete, I'm going to start switching to more detail. I'm using a smaller brush with a very fine point, and the reason I love this brush especially is because it's really easy to get a dry brush texture. So if I want to add a big amount of color, I'll use my big fat juicy brush, but a slightly smaller skinnier brush is so good because it doesn't hold as much water, it dries out quickly, and it lets me just graze that color over the rough surface of the paper. So we're probably about 75% done with the painting. The last bit of it is mostly just going to be a lot of dry brush textures and marks and the exposed rock color, which is going to be a very dark color. I'm actually using the Sodalite Genuine that Lauren got me as a gift, so it's kind of fun to be able to use that in the painting that I'm sending to her. And it's a really beautiful granulating dark grayish color, so it's perfect for exposed rock. Let's quickly take a look at a reference that I think you guys might have fun painting using these techniques. This one is great because it's super obvious where the highlights and the shadows are. But for now, let's look at the exposed rock. In the bright sunny areas, it's really dark, almost a blackish brown color. In the shadow areas, it leans more towards a dark bluish black color. So this is something you can have fun playing with, but if you want to keep it pretty simple, you can use one color for everything. Just choose a very dark color, like black with a bit of blue mixed in or black with a bit of brown mixed in, just something that isn't overly colorful. And when I start painting that dark exposed rock, I'll use really quick kind of jagged marks because I don't want it to look overly stiff or anything. When I work quickly, I get much better organic results. It gets really addictive, so you can go overboard with this, but you know, just start a little bit slow in one area and see how it's going and then continue on. And don't be afraid to let your rock color overlap into any wet, shadowy areas. It can create a really nice effect. When I'm painting a scene that has exposed rock, I try to isolate that rock color as its own shape, regardless of whether it's in a highlight or a shadow. As you can see here, when I zoom into this area, we can identify a few big chunks of the rock color that are in both highlight and shadow. Even if you paint the rock color as a single dark color, a single dark value, the viewer's eye will make sense of the shadows and the highlights because of the other layer you did, that bright white and the dark blue shadows. And your rock color is technically glazing over the shadows you've already done, so it is shifting in color and value slightly. If you look at how I'm holding my brush, it's very, very loose. Like my fingers are just putting enough grip on the brush so that I don't drop it. And the reason for this is because it allows me to get the lightest touch. It means that I can just ever so slightly graze the brush bristles over the surface of the paper, and just a tiny bit of that pigment deposits onto the highest ridges of the paper. This is so perfect for creating rough rock texture. It's like the ultimate dry brush application. Plus, for me, it allows me to create more random and more organic looking shapes. So instead of trying to force it and like purposefully try to create something random, I'm allowing the pigment and the brush and the supplies to do their thing. I'm just there to guide them a little bit. Well, I think that about wraps up all of the techniques I use in a painting like this. I really hope it was helpful and maybe inspires you guys to try painting some snowy mountains. Don't forget, I have a bunch of tutorials on Patreon as well as Skillshare and downloadable on Gumroad. They're everywhere, you guys. Okay, thank you all so much for watching and for your support. I'll see you all again soon. Take care.